Okay, this week we're talking about Kenny's 2002 article on building visual communication theory by borrowing from rhetoric. So we'll start with a definition of rhetoric. Rhetoric considers how people use symbols to alter perception, to reinforce and channel belief, to initiate and maintain action, as well as to foster or undermine a competing ideology, which is a concept we discussed way back at the beginning of class. So within this symbolic perspective, the creators of a visual image can call an audience into being. The creator can ask the audience to see themselves in a particular way in order to speak to the issue of social change and power. Within this symbolic perspective, then, understanding the intentions of the communicator is less important. Meaning is now the result of an audience's efforts as much as, if not more than, whoever created the message. So that's a concept you want to keep in mind as we keep going through these slides. So for example, we can see this idea about audience in the current national discourse around the logo and branding of the Washington Redskins. When the team was named in the 1930s, no one gave much thought to whether or not the term might offend anyone. But by the 1940s, the National Congress of American Indians was campaigning for the elimination of negative stereotyping of Native people in the media. Over the next few decades, that campaign began to include the naming of sports team mascots. As the public, think of the public as the audience, became more aware of how negative stereotypes can be reinforced by these kinds of images, the way a growing proportion of the audience interpreted the image began to change. For this portion of the audience, the intent of the creators and current owners of the image doesn't really matter. One thing I want you to think about for the activities you're going to do this week is, how does the elaboration likelihood model help explain this change in the way the audience interprets the meaning of the images? Okay, next, let's talk about identification, which is actively thinking about another person or group's perspective and finding common interests that will make persuasion possible. Identification is such an important element of persuasion. Think about what it feels like to be judged by someone or what it feels like not to trust someone. Are you likely to be persuaded by that person? Absolutely not. So let's think about how visual images might work to highlight common experiences. So obviously, a major source of visual images in our culture comes from movies. So a movie like Boys in the Hood tells rural residents and suburban residents who don't live in the city about the struggles of urban youth to find a sense of self-respect, how violence becomes attractive, and the challenges of breaking that cycle. And we can all find common ground in the idea of wanting to move forward or to do even better than our parents. That's where the common ground and identification aspect comes in. But remember that audience is key. These common visual rhetorical experiences can also be used to separate us, quote unquote, from them. So for example, that rural suburban audience, if they choose to focus on these sorts of images, they probably won't find that common ground. So it's not a direct effect. Next, let's talk a little bit about how visual images can help establish stories and myths. Myths, of course, are master stories describing exceptional people doing exceptional things. They often serve as moral guides to proper action. So myths tell us why we're here, where we came from, and what our ancestors were like. We hear these myths from lots of places, like the stories our parents tell us, textbooks, and movies. The important thing to remember is that myth doesn't serve as a literal truth. The myth is important to us because it serves some larger purpose. It may encourage us to believe that settlers and native people worked harmoniously together, like the story of Pocahontas and John Smith. It may help teach us that we should be honest about the things we do, like the story that George Washington admitted he cut down the cherry tree. It doesn't matter that we can't be sure that the story is historically accurate. The story serves a larger purpose that's unrelated to historical accuracy. visual images help cement the stories we tell ourselves. So images of the American West and cowboys and horses are central to many Americans' identities, and they help emphasize the story that we're adventurous and that we work hard. Images like this iconic Norman Rockwell picture help cement the idea that family has a central importance in our lives. Myths give us heroes to admire, like Rosa Parks. Of course, myths don't tell everyone's story, which is why it's so important that we spend some time thinking critically about how they operate on a cultural and ideological level. Next, let's talk about iconic images, which are widely known and well established. They document universal moments in the passage of time that take us to places we might otherwise not have experienced. Your article asks the question, can iconic visual images emotionally sway world opinion and force policymakers to respond? Let's take a look at some recent iconic images and see. Two of the most iconic photographs of the Vietnam era were of the Kent State shootings in 1970 and of a napalm attack in 1972. In this first photo, for which John Philo won a 1971 Pulitzer Prize, we see a young woman screaming over the body of Jeffrey Miller minutes after he was shot by the Ohio National Guard during a campus protest of the Vietnam War. This photograph came to represent the anti-war movement that was gaining strength in the early 1970s. This photograph captures the aftermath of a 1972 napalm attack on a Vietnamese village. The village was attacked by South Vietnam because it had been occupied by North Vietnamese forces. The fleeing civilians were mistaken for the enemy. Although she was hospitalized for over a year, this little girl survived the attack, and for many of us, this single image came to represent the horror of the Vietnam War. This compelling and disturbing photograph is called The Vulture and the Baby. It was taken in 1993 by Kevin Carter, who was in the Sudan to document the Civil War. But Sudan was also on the brink of famine, and he took this photo right outside a feeding station. He took the photograph and then shooed the vulture away, and the photograph ended up being published widely throughout the world. Unfortunately, no one would suggest that this photo made a difference in policy. Nothing improved because it was taken and published. So my question to you is, does a photograph like this serve a purpose if no specific concrete good comes from it? Your article references David Perlmutter and what he called a theory of visual determinism in his book, Photojournalism and Foreign Policy. One of the things he argued was that iconic pictures do not have clear meanings. He argues that we, the audience, project meanings onto pictures rather than inspect the pictures for meanings. In 2002, photographer Todd Heisler spent a year profiling the funerals of Marines who died in the Iraq War. These two photos are of Catherine Cathy, whose husband James died in Iraq. Now, some people might look at these photos and see a story of dedication, patriotism, and sacrifice, while others might look at the same photos and see an indictment of our country's foreign policy. And this illustrates this concept that Perlmutter was talking about. Finally, here's an iconic photograph of Tommie Smith and John Carlos, who won first and third in the 200-meter race at the 1968 Olympics. When they raised their arms on the podium while the American national anthem played, they were unprepared for the firestorm of criticism they would face. They were booed by the crowds as they left the podium. Time magazine ended up showing the photo with a caption that read, "Angrier, nastier, uglier," rather than the Olympic slogan of faster, higher, stronger. In his autobiography, Tommie Smith said that the gesture was not a Black Power salute, but a human rights salute. He also said they were supporting those individuals who were lynched or killed that no one had said a prayer for. In your article, Kenny argues that images like these transcend the specifics of their immediate visual references and become what are called ideographs. Ideographs are symbols of a more universal concept or idea. Now that we've spent 6 weeks thinking about it, where do you come down on this? Are visual images on their own strong enough to count as persuasion? That's what you'll be working on this week.